Here is a narration script designed for a 20-minute ambient video. It is written with a slow, meditative cadence, focusing on atmospheric and sociological reflection rather than visceral horror. Why were there so many serial killers in the 70s? Meditative, melancholic, historical, soothing. Very slow, approximately 80 WPM. Word count, approximate 1600 words. Introduction. The atmosphere of an era. Let yourself settle in now, finding a comfortable position where your body can rest, and your mind can begin to drift. Close your eyes, and let the worries of the present day fade into the background, replaced by the soft, grainy texture of memory. We are going to take a journey back in time, not to a place of fear, but to a landscape of history, observing a specific moment in the human story from a safe and distant vantage point. Imagine the world as it was 5 decades ago. Picture the colors of the 1970s, the sepia tones of old photographs, the warm, saturated oranges and browns that adorned the living rooms of the era. It was a time that felt distinct, a bridge between the old world and the new. The air feels different here. There is a certain heaviness, a static charge that hangs over the cities and the sprawling suburbs. It was a decade of transition, a time when the optimism of the past began to curdle into something more complex, something more shadowed. We look back at this time and wonder, why did the shadows seem to lengthen during these years? Why did this specific era, this window of time, give rise to so many wandering figures, lost souls who drifted across the highways and hid within the crowds? It is a mystery that requires us to look not at violence, but at the silence between the noise, at the spaces between the towns, and the quiet, unseen shifts in the way we lived our lives. The open road and the drifter. Visualize the great American landscape of the mid-century. The most defining feature of this time was the road. The interstate highway system, vast ribbons of concrete stretching endlessly across the plains, cutting through mountains and connecting the disconnected. It was a time of immense mobility. For the first time in history, a person could get into a car on one coast and disappear into the horizon, emerging days later in a completely different world. There was a romance to this freedom, the wind rushing through open windows, the hum of the engine, the hypnotic rhythm of passing lane markers. But with this freedom came a new kind of anonymity. The drifter became a common figure in the collective consciousness. In the 1970s, it was not unusual to see a figure standing by the roadside, thumb out, waiting for a ride. Hitchhiking was a part of the culture, a symbol of trust and of a generation seeking adventure. But this mobility created a transient world. People were no longer rooted to the earth like the generations before them. They were fluid, moving like water across the map. And in this fluidity, it became easy for shadows to move unnoticed. Imagine the long stretches of highway at night, the only light coming from the dashboard, and the twin beams of headlights cutting through the dark. In this vastness, identities could be shed, and secrets could be carried for thousands of miles without ever being discovered. The analog silence. As we drift deeper into this era, we must remember the silence of the technology. We live today in a world of constant connection, where every step is recorded, every face is recognized by a digital eye. But the 1970s was a world of paper and ink. It was an analog world. Information moved slowly, traveling at the speed of the mail carrier, or the telephone wire. Imagine a police station in a small town in 1975. The air smells of stale coffee and typewriter ribbon. There are no computers humming on the desks. There are no databases that speak to one another across state lines. There are only filing cabinets, heavy metal drawers filled with paper folders, thousands of them. If a person committed a crime in one county and then drove 50 miles to the next, they effectively became a new person. The records did not follow them. The patterns were lost in the physical distance. It was a fog of information, a disconnect that allowed mysteries to endure. This lack of communication created a protective veil for those who wished to remain hidden. A shadow could move from town to town, and to the local authorities, they were just another face in the crowd, a stranger passing through, leaving no digital footprint, no electronic trace, only the fading memory of a presence. The fracturing of community. Let us turn our gaze now to the neighborhoods themselves. The structure of society was shifting beneath the feet of the population. In the decades prior, communities were tight circles. Everyone knew the name of the grocer, the postman, the family down the street. But the 1970s brought a great migration to the suburbs and a fracturing of these old bonds. People began to live in rows of identical houses, separated by fences and manicured lawns. The front porch, once a place of gathering and observation, was replaced by the backyard patio, a private sanctuary hidden from view. We began to know our neighbors less. The concept of the stranger became more prevalent. In the cities, high-rise apartments stacked lives on top of one another, yet created a profound sense of isolation. One could be surrounded by thousands of people and yet be completely unknown. This social anonymity provided a camouflage. It was a time of dislocation, where the social fabric was stretching thin. In this environment, unusual behaviors went unnoticed. The eccentricities of the quiet man down the hall were ignored because we were all learning to look away, to mind our own business, to retreat into our own private worlds. The shadow figures of the 1970s thrived in this disconnect. They were the neighbors we waved to but did not know. They were the faces in the crowd that blended into the background, protected by our own growing sense of isolation. The cultural psyche and disillusionment. To understand the atmosphere of this time, we must also feel the emotional weight of the culture. The 1970s was a decade of coming down, a hangover from the intense energy of the 1960s. The previous decade had been filled with dreams of peace, of revolution, of a new age of understanding. But as the calendar turned, many of those dreams had faded. The news was filled with images of war, of political scandal, of economic hardship. There was a collective sense of disillusionment, a feeling that the institutions we trusted were crumbling. Trust in the government, in the police, in the safety of the world was eroding. This psychological climate created a fertile ground for fear. When a society feels unmoored, when the old rules no longer seem to apply, the imagination can turn toward darker corners. The media began to change as well. We saw the rise of the 24-hour news cycle, the sensationalism of crime. The serial killer became a figure of dark celebrity, a boogeyman for the modern age. We must consider, did the media create the monsters, or merely shine a brighter light on them? Perhaps it was a cycle, a feedback loop where the fear of the public fed the notoriety of the phantom, and the notoriety inspired others to step into the darkness. The invisible fog. Environmental theories. As we continue our contemplation, we drift toward a theory that is less about psychology and more about the very air we breathed. Picture the streets of the 1970s again. The cars are large, heavy machines of steel and chrome, and from their exhaust pipes flows a steady stream of grey smoke. For decades, gasoline was filled with lead. It was an invisible poison pumped into the atmosphere by the ton, settling as dust on the windowsills, on the playgrounds, in the soil. Science has shown us that lead is a neurotoxin, a heavy metal that affects the brain, specifically the areas responsible for impulse control, for empathy, for reasoning. Some historians and scientists suggest that the generation coming of age in the 1970s was a generation that had been breathing this heavy air since birth. It is a tragic thought that the very fuel that powered our freedom, the gasoline that allowed us to roam the highways, might have been altering the chemistry of our minds. Imagine a world where the aggression, the lack of control, was not just a moral failing, but a physical symptom of a poisoned environment. As the lead levels rose in the mid-century, so did the violence. And as the lead was removed in the years that followed, the shadows began to recede. It is a quiet theory, one that speaks to the fragile connection between our biology and the world we build around us. The deinstitutionalization. There is one more thread in this tapestry, a thread of sorrow and neglect. In the mid-20th century, the great asylums and mental institutions began to close their doors. It was a movement born of good intentions, a desire to treat patients with more dignity, to integrate them back into society. But the support systems were not there. The safety nets were not woven tight enough. Thousands of troubled souls, individuals who struggled with the darkness in their own minds, were released into a world that was not ready for them. They drifted into the cities, into the transient hotels, and onto the streets. Many became victims, lost in the cracks of society. But for a small few, the lack of supervision, the lack of care, allowed their internal chaos to manifest outwardly. The 1970s was a time when the mental health system was in a state of collapse, a gap between the old way and the new. And in that gap, tragedy was allowed to bloom. It was a failure of care, a societal overlooking of the most vulnerable and the most dangerous. The closing of the era. The sun begins to set on the decade of the 1970s. The colors shift from the warm oranges to the cool blues of the 1980s and 90s. The world began to change again. Technology arrived, slowly at first, then in a rushing tide. DNA profiling was discovered, a light so bright that it banished many of the shadows. Computers linked the police stations, the cameras appeared on the street corners, the anonymity of the open road began to vanish. The drifter could no longer move without leaving a trace. The lead was taken from the air. The communities reorganized. The golden age of the serial killer, if one can call it that, came to an end. The specific conditions, the perfect storm of mobility, isolation, analog silence, and toxins, dissipated like mist in the morning sun. We look back at that time now as a closed chapter, a dark curiosity in the history of the modern world. It was a time when the world was large enough to hide in and quiet enough for secrets to be kept. Conclusion and rest. As we conclude our journey, let the images of the past fade away. The highways are empty now, the old cars are parked, the static of the television has turned to silence. You are safe here, in the present moment. The mysteries of the past cannot touch you. They are merely stories, echoes of a time that has moved on. Feel the comfort of your own space, the stillness of the room around you, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. We have explored the shadows, and we have returned to the light. The questions have been asked, and the answers drift away like leaves on a slow-moving river. Let your mind rest now. Let the history books close. There is nothing left to solve. There is only the quiet, the peace, and the deep, restorative sleep that awaits you. Good night.